Thank you. Deputy Catherine Connolly.
Thank you very much, and thank you. And I'd like to start by thanking the brave women who brought this matter to our attention, and the courage they showed, in particular the woman who didn't sign the confidentiality agreement, because clearly the provisions in Bean wouldn't have brought anything to our attention, and all of this is retrospective. So when we thank Dr. Scally, and certainly our gratitude is due to him and our appreciation rather than gratitude, it is to the women that I give my respect and my gratitude, because without them we would not be aware of any of this. That's number one. The report is a supplementary report to the main report last September, and Minister, I would ask you to go back and read it rather than taking a selected number of points from it. Well then, let me just highlight some then. 2 recommendations follow on 50, and we'll come back to them during the questions. The reason for the supplemental report was that there were issues that he was worried about, Dr. Scally, in relation to tendering, contracting and the operation of laboratories. And so he goes forward. And his key points, Minister, is, as we've said already, my colleagues here, not 6 laboratories, but finally 16. The use of their laboratories were not approved in advance. 1 lab in England was retrospectively accredited, and the system in place for responding to errors in Ireland to the screening is inadequate to the task. Pretty damning, you think. I'd like to go through in detail the findings in relation to the 3 companies involved, but my time is limited, so I'm going to go straight to the key statements of Dr. Scally. It is profoundly disappointing that the scoping inquiry only learned about the additional laboratories as a result of its extensive and intensive probing, and I would say in addition to people coming forward and alerting the inquiry about possibilities of laboratories in other areas, including Mexico and India, which I hope I'll have time to come back to. He says it's disappointing that not one of the bodies involved retained complete records for a period of time over the last decade. No records. No knowledge of the laboratories on behalf of the screening service and the health executive meant that the National Cancer Screening Service had no means of assessing the accreditation, the quality standards, the governance or the other critical features regarding the suitability of these laboratories to undertake cervical check work. He says the most benign interpretation, I certainly wouldn't agree with them, I'd give a different interpretation, but the most benign interpretation of these events is that neither party, can you imagine this, appears to have understood or articulated the importance of the role of the NCSS in monitoring the quality and the safety of the laboratories, and the importance of documenting how and where the work was being done, how it was being monitored and so on. He says it's disappointing that it took Quest more than 6 months from the time of the scoping inquiry's first engagement to disclose the involvement of the 4 laboratories. Now, what's extraordinary about that statement, he goes on to take their word later on in relation to no laboratories in India or Mexico. He takes their word on that. They haven't proved that they hadn't complied with their word prior to that. He says the lack of transparency by the major private sector laboratory companies about the precise locations of their screening services provided to CervicalCheck is entirely unsatisfactory. He says that the tendering process appeared to move over time to place an increasing emphasis on price rather than quality. I would have thought that might be something you would have focused in on, an emphasis on price rather than quality. The use of additional laboratories without express authorisation lay outside the boundaries of the contracts. And the introduction of additional laboratories with no previous experience of CervicalCheck did introduce a potential risk. The lack of transparency by the major private sector laboratory companies about the precise location of their screening services provided was entirely unsatisfactory. And of course, the most important thing, the reasons for requiring prior written permission to use additional laboratories were to ensure accreditation and quality of service, to enable CervicalCheck to monitor and gauge the risks, and to maintain overall transparency with this screening programme, and so on. Now, Minister, if the organisation responsible for looking after women's health is not in a position to carry out quality assurance because they don't know the laboratories exist, we have a serious problem, isn't that right? And That arises from the fatal decision to outsource back in 2008 to Quest and the other companies, and to go forward with outsourcing to America, a company based in Australia, and then we've all the labs going from Honolulu to Texas, 5 hours time difference, 4,000 miles in the difference, and trying to carry out quality assurance. And presumably you might elaborate on how that's done. Do teams of Irish experts go out there and examine each laboratory, the ones they know about? Can you imagine that for a system? And you're given a 4-page speech here, and you give no reference to any of those as to how we might learn from this. And finally, because my time is up, how we're going to stop the outsourcing. Because ironically, one of the companies has specifically come back to the idea that they should be located in Ireland, where it should have never moved from in the first place. You'd agree with that. They're gone right back to Dublin. They were based elsewhere and set up in Dublin because it was much more efficient and effective. Now, at this point, I would appeal to you to come forward and tell us what plan the government has to stop the outsourcing. What capacity have we now, and when will we have the capacity to provide a proper screening service to the women of Ireland who deserve it? Thank you.